Welcome everyone to today's presentation of a CACOR funded project to try and illuminate what choices the Canadian society needs to make to achieve Canadian government stated targets of GHG reductions or greenhouse gas reductions. I'd like to thank the authors of the major report, Rob Hoffman and John Hollins, for their enormous effort and dedication in producing the report that is available on the CACOR website, canadiancore.com. I'd also like to thank the remainder of the Pathways project team, but in particular, Catherine Smith and Ted Manning for their contributions in supporting Rob and John in completing this report. It was an enormous effort on everyone's part, and I truly, truly appreciate that. Today's speakers are going to be Dave Dougherty and David Pollock, both members of the Pathways team, and they'll be giving us a talk today. Dave will be doing the summary of the results, followed by David Pollock to lead us in a discussion of what CACOR can do now. Both are longstanding CACOR members. Dave Dougherty is a retired environmental scientist, and David Pollock is our CACOR Past Chair with extensive experience leading nonprofit organizations interested in environmental and social justice issues. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks very much, Jean. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and bring back another one. Right. So, oh, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong one. Where are we? Here. Okay. So there's a little quote here, which I picked up when I was looking for something to use as a starting slide. I was looking actually for something reflective of the very intense drought that's been happening in Western North America this year, and was surprised to find this. And I think it gives some sense for the challenge that's in front of us at the moment. We do need to find a pathway or more than one pathway to a stable climate, but not everybody's on board quite yet. I want to give you a sense for just how much humanity has been changing Earth. So if you look over on the left side, we got about a 200-year difference between the first two lines and a 50-year difference between the second. The population in the world has gone from about 0.77, call it 0.8 billion people, to 7.8 billion people. So we have added 7 billion people in that 250 years. We really didn't have a measure for gross domestic product at 1760, which is a reasonable date to use for the start of the Industrial Revolution. We do now know that it's around $85 trillion. The GDP per person has been estimated to have been in the range of something under $1,000. Of course, there were some very rich people and many very poor people. It's now in the range of $11,000 US. I believe that's purchasing power parity, they call it. Emissions essentially went from nothing because we were really not burning fossil fuels in any substantive way. We were mostly burning wood and straw and a few other things like that. And now we are at about 34 gigatons. This is just at around the time the pandemic hit us. Got to move my screen out of the way here if I can. Okay, and our CO2 emissions per person have gone from essentially 0 to about 4.4 tons per person on average. But the changes that happened in Canada have been really quite different. Best estimate we have for 1760 population is well under 1 million, and we're now at nearly 38 million. This is over here on the left. Our GDP went from, for all intents and purposes, 0 to $1.6 trillion, $1,640 trillion US. Our GDP per person has gone from essentially nothing to $43,000. Our emissions went from 0 to in the range of 700 megatons. And our CO2 per person went from essentially 0 to about 18.5. And we're in the top 10 countries for emissions, total and per person. So what has happened as a result of countries like ours and many others emitting all this carbon dioxide? The carbon dioxide pre-industrial revolution was at about 278 parts per million. It's not actually at Mauna Loa. That's been estimated from gases taken out of ice cores and a number of other indicators. It was 326 in 1970. It was 412 on average for the year in 2020, and it peaked at a little bit over 420. The average temperature anomaly went from essentially 0 to about 1 degree, a little over 1 degree. And that is the highest concentration of carbon dioxide that we've had in the atmosphere for at least about 3 million years, maybe more. So recently there was an IPCC review published. The yellow is quoted text that I took, only changed the and to an ampersand. Right out of the report, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change now feels there's unequivocal proof that we are warming the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land. We know there's rapid change, widespread change, and we know that it's as a result of human activities. You can see it clearly, graph taken right out of that report. Most of the warming has happened in the last 50 years, and we know that it isn't the result of natural cycles. On the right-hand side, you can see that they have done studies on how natural cycles have been affecting the temperature, and the temperature rise observed is not the result of it. So it's what we've been doing, and it's really come home in the last 50 years. To give you a sense just for how widespread this is, it's not taken from the report. You can see the origin of this graphic on the lower right, but these recent changes have been unprecedented, and they've essentially been everywhere. There's the odd spot where, as a result of heat flows, some areas have had changed ocean circulation, and it's very slightly colder than they had been in the past, but over the land, virtually everywhere is now warmer than it had been. And this is from the 1951 to 1980 average rather than from pre-industrial conditions. It's a more intense red map. It would be if I could find one, but I wasn't able to find one in the time I had available. So human-induced climate change is affecting us. It's affecting everybody. The evidence is all over the place in lots of different ways. And if anything, the evidence that it's happening has strengthened since the last report from the IPCC was published in 2014. We've got better knowledge of what's going on, the processes. We have better paleoclimatic evidence. We know that the climate system is responding to the radiative forcing that we're getting as a result of this. And it looks like the climate sensitivity, that's if you double the CO2, the sort of average global temperature increase that you get is about 3 degrees. And if we remain on our current path, we will very shortly have doubled the concentration. Sorry. So my conclusion in response to the fellow on the first page is, sorry, mate, your few decades of local experience doesn't negate all the scientific studies that have been getting done by thousands of researchers around the world. Climate change is happening, and it's because of human activity, and that's primarily greenhouse gas emission. We have unprecedented numbers and industrial societies, and we have destabilized the Earth's climate as a result. So this had really become evidence to many members in CACOR several years ago. We decided to see what we could do about it in terms of running a study. We engaged a firm called What If Technologies, whose head is a member of CACOR and was part of our Pathways team. That's Rob Hoffman. And we asked them to run various simulations through a stock and flow model. It's very well explained in the report, the final draft of which I think was put up on our website either today or yesterday, or it's queued up to go later in the week. What follows are some of their data that I've extracted and interpretations I've made. Some of these observations are in the report itself and some are my own. The details on the modeling, I didn't feel were things I could touch on in this presentation, but there is a kind of summary paper that I wrote. It's about 25 pages. And this new final draft is now available. It's about 50 pages. It'll give you lots of detail about how exactly they went about running this model. Suffice to say, there were successive runs, and every time you did a run, you added new stuff without taking away what you had already simulated. They ran it through 2060, which is a little bit beyond where some of Canada's current targets are at 2050, and the rest of the world is mirroring us. Remains to be seen whether Canada's emission targets, together with those of other countries, are going to be sufficient to stabilize the climate. It's one thing to set targets, it's another thing actually to meet those targets. One thing that I think really needs to be addressed is making sure that all the other countries come along with this with us in this journey. It isn't sufficient for us to cut our emissions if nobody else does. But as one of the countries that's in the top 10 total and per capita, I think it's really important that we do our fair share. So we had really varied conditions across the country. You can do a calculation of Canada's emissions as a whole and our emissions per person. That's in the top left here, 38 billion of us putting out 700 gigatons. Sorry, that should say megatons. And our CO2 at about 18.5, but it's very different on a provincial basis. You've got Quebec at 9.8, you've got Prince Edward Island at 9, that's the bottom of the scale. You've got Alberta at 61 and Saskatchewan at 62, so vastly different across the country. And subsequently, I'm going to show you first on a national basis where we are, and secondly, where the various provinces are. So it looks like we are unlikely to meet our Paris target as it was originally set in 2015, which was a reduction of 30% from the 2005 level. So we would have to get from the 2005 level down to about 517 megatons. We have recently, however, published a new nationally determined contribution, so our second NDC, and it's down between 40 and 45%, which would take us to in the neighborhood of 406 to 443 megatons. If we don't reduce fossil fuel production, it's going to be very difficult for us to meet those targets. And net zero, which we had hoped to reach by 2050, 2050 being down here on the bottom stripe, is a remote possibility. The reason that I put this in here is that originally we didn't have a target related to 2050, but in the second NDC, we do have one, which for all intents and purposes at the moment is down 100% from 2005. The reason being, we don't currently have a technology to remove our carbon emissions from the atmosphere. So if we can't get drawdown, it's going to be impossible to meet net zero unless we cut to zero. So for the moment, essentially what we have to do is say, well, we're targeting reading zero. So let's go back here to the left side. The base case is 700 megatons. In 2030, it looks like our scenario, our base case scenario simulation will be at 670 based on known plans for addressing emissions. So this is all the things to which provinces and federal government have already committed themselves. A 5% drop, not a 30% drop. If, on the other hand, we electrify as much as we possibly can and switch over as much as we possibly can to the use of renewable energy, especially for the production of electricity, we probably can meet around 530 megatons, which is a 24% reduction, but we're still not where we need to get. And we'd have to phase out fossil fuel fired power, bitumen, and especially fracked natural gas to get down into the range that we would need to meet at 517. As far as 2050 goes, our base case simulation shows will actually increase. This is mainly the result of population increase from planned immigration to the country. If we electrify intensively and use renewable energy, phase out our coal-fired plants, for example, which is already planned, we can probably get down to around 480, which is minus 30%. If we also take out all the fossil fuel-fired power, natural gas plants, coal plants, all the bitumen production, the frack gas, we can probably get down to around 61% below 2005 at a 270 megatons, but we're still a long way from zero. So that's the national picture. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are, I suppose, the good news. They've got very low CO2 per person already. They can easily go lower with the plans they've got in place over here in the base case. It looks like they can probably get down by about 57% if they intensively electrify and go all renewable energy sources. They can be down about 78%. By 2050, down 90% or so. This is really very good. Same thing over here in New Brunswick. Looks like the good news story. Ontario and Quebec, well, good news too, in that they can get some pretty excellent reductions. Can't do it just using the base case of existing plans, but if they electrify and go to renewable energy intensively, yeah, we can hit even the second NDC for Ontario and also for Quebec. We can't, on the other hand, get anywhere near net zero. So we have to keep that in mind. I've got a comment about that at the end. BC and New Brunswick, well, bad news. Not going to make the Paris target from 2015, let alone the second nationally determined contribution, and we're not going to get anywhere near net zero. And then there's Saskatchewan and Alberta. This is the really bad news. Emissions cannot be reduced to target even phasing out fossil fuel fired power plants and oil and gas production. With current plans, it's just sky high. You might note also on the bottom line, 37 tons per person in Alberta, 24 tons per person in Saskatchewan. This is so far beyond the average for the world that it's unbelievable. The only kinds of places that beat us are some of the big oil producers like Qatar. So population growth is a major driver of this. We may need to address this in the fairly short term. Our current plans are basically to increase population 1% per year. And the more people we have, the more we're going to be increasing. the emissions are going to rise as a result of that unless they're offset by some kind of continuing technology change or by some kind of change in the way that we organize society. Evolving emissions policy may increase our chance of reaching our current targets. I don't have a whole lot of hope for that. Excuse me. Net zero will require new technology. I don't think we're going to be able to deploy this at scale in time. Here's an example of why some of the things that people are currently planning just are going to be so hard to do. We've been talking about planting 2 billion trees. Well, if you plant a seedling, typically not all of your seedlings are going to survive to maturity, but we really need to plant about 13.5 billion mature trees, enough seedlings to get that number of mature trees. This is a mind-boggling task. So phasing out fossil fuels, I think, is really critical. There's much more on this on our website, both related to the Pathways project itself and other information sources, including videos in this Zoom presentation program that we've been putting on. And that's the end of my talk for now. I'm happy to answer questions after David Pollock has had his chance. Now I'm going to pull you out of the way and stop.
Thank you, David. And David, when you're ready to go, please feel free to go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to move back into screen share for a moment here. I'm going to look at a short embedded video partway through, and we've been having some issues with it, so it may take a moment to actually bring it up to a way that we can all hear it, but I'll do my best to do that. I wanted to try to get us out of our heads a little bit now and into the whole theme of advocacy, because we can do academic studies till the cows come home, but we need to actually find ways and means of moving public opinion and decision makers, opinion leaders, both in Canada and internationally. And so that's to be my focus. And I'll just start with the little story that years ago, one of my friends, Clark MacDonald, was moderator of the United Church of Canada in a protest, a massive march in New York City. I think it was an anti-nuclear protest. And a stranger approached him as they walked along side by side. And he said, you know, I just feel like a grain of sand on the beach. I keep doing this advocacy work and protest work, and what good does it do? And I just feel like a grain of sand. And Clark MacDonald thought for a moment, and he said, you know, that's true, but those grains of sand all together form the beaches that hold back the tide. And then the two of them sort of gently parted and didn't speak again and went on their way. And so I think it's very important to know that advocacy efforts, we're not alone in these efforts, and that all together, collectively, we can make an enormous difference. And so we have to simply choose, what part will we play? I want to talk about two different kinds of advocacy. One is along the lines of what I would call the moral imperative or existential. So for example, to end slavery is a good example of a moral imperative, need to advocate for some monstrous evil. You could perhaps even put the idea of the need to end economic growth into that moral imperative, into that existential kind of advocacy, or the work that Bill Reese has been doing on overshoot. All of that is a certain kind of advocacy where the results can be very, very slow, but very, very important to accomplish. And you may feel at times as if you're being labeled on part of the lunatic fringe, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. The other kind of advocacy is what people assess as perhaps more politically feasible, politically possible. So I would put, the lobbying out of our work of pathways to electrify transportation, for example, or one I was involved when I was with Pembina to get the government to give tax credits for wind energy production or rebates for electric cars. A series of smaller measures that people will sit down in a room with you and at least in your own mind, you believe that those things you're advocating for are on the right trajectory, even if they're only a smaller part of the major changes. Now, what Pathways has found is an implication that we might choose either or both of these kinds of advocacy, because our knowledge now of what kind of emergency climate change is suggesting the need for enormous social, economic, and cultural change. But we also need to go into hearts and minds and living rooms and boardrooms and member of Parliament's offices. And we have to start in a way that they can hear us and listen to us. And there's a whole different variety of specific points that can be advocated for. I drafted a list of 13 questions just to kick off some discussion. And people have rightly made the point, but let's boil it down to 3 points in terms of pathways. This is an example, just to go back, John Hollins, who's done so much work on the core report. It's a quotation from him of this, what I would call the more moral imperative or existential piece. If we just read this yourselves. So that goes back to the core understanding of CACOR, that there are limits to growth and that we need to find ways to transform our entire economy such that it doesn't rely on year-over-year increases in gross domestic product. Our study, however, in Pathways was not specifically trying to look at that issue, but we were trying to look at the energy system. This is another example when Bill Reese's work arguing the problem is overshoot, that this curve of growth needs flattening. He's looking at population and consumption over time. And he has argued for years that the human enterprise will contract. And it's simply a question of, can we advocate for a well-planned and orderly and cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all, that we're so far above sustainability that drastic change is required, along the lines, I think, toward the end that Dave was also alluding to. What is interesting, though, one historian has talked about the shift in the enormous understanding that led to the end of slavery. And if you look at the specific lobbying advocacy from about 1789 onwards, it wasn't until 1807 that slave trade was made illegal, and I think 1838 when slavery was made illegal. But this historian writes that there seems to have been a shifting of the tectonic plates, a small series of movements which produced massive consequences. To do lobbying and to have someone in the room with you who will listen to you, you usually need to advocate something that is smaller than what you might want. But the challenge in climate change is our time span frame is so limited that we need to try to find ways where we can to speed up these small series of movements, because we don't have, between 1789 as the British Parliament did in 1807, we need to move toward more rapid change. And that's the discovery of Pathways, which is reinforcing what many others have said for a long time. But there are some new things within Pathways as well. So I just want to make the point that I think it's a mug's game to try to figure out how you most successfully lobby. I want to make the argument that it's a whole collectivity along a continuum within society Years ago, I was considered part of the lunatic fringe when I was helping lead a campaign against government loans to then apartheid South Africa. But I noted that 4 years later, the very same things we, the lunatic fringe, were advocating were the same serious proposals in the top drawer of senior bureaucrats in Ottawa. And so lobbying and social change and understanding takes periods of time. And whether you're positioning yourself at the lunatic fringe or involved in mass demonstrations or boycotts or letter writing and opinion pieces or having dinner with a cabinet minister or making presentations to editors of newspapers or presentations to municipal, provincial, or federal civil servants or elected representatives, it's all a part of a piece that changes a context which allows serious policy change and serious cultural economic changes to occur. There's some things we can advocate as individuals. There's other things we can do as organizations. And perhaps most effective of all, there are things that are done in collaboration where we can seek them out with other organizations, groups, and individuals, which can be much more powerful. So a key question for us to ask ourselves at an individual level is, what is our personal skill and knowledge, maybe our time and energy, our health? What's our psychological comfort level? And then what's our access to influence? Because everything that you can do at this point to advocate helps. When it comes to finding what we need to do in relation to pathways, the entire study is really summarized in this lovely slide that I think John Hollins has put together. So that you see again and again, the reference cumulatively affects from making changes in our residential buildings, our commercial buildings, our industrial buildings, our transportation systems, all of those with the word electrification after them. And then we see the phasing out of that portion, about 9.5% of our electricity, which is currently still produced through fossil fuel. It's the second largest after hydro still. And then you see what happens if we phase out the oil sands, as Dave was referencing, and finally the production of natural gas. So somewhere in all of these findings, we can refer back to, and we should use our CACOR website to get anyone that's in a conversation with us interested to have them go back and look at the detail more fully. But within these findings in these areas, we can find three things, I would say, to advocate for as individuals and as an organization, even if you bite them off in small pieces. The first one is, and Dave was referencing this, we must find a way to phase out, transition away fairly, stop, use whatever language you want, the production of most oil and gas, period. There may always be some production for chemical uses that we don't have substitutes for, or for example, emergency helicopter use getting into remote locations until electrification is possible. As a society, we may be willing to say we'll produce a certain smallish amount of greenhouse gases for those emergency purposes. But in the main, the entire economic piece needs to be phased out, a transition. That's the first finding. The second finding is that we need to use electricity. There's really two parts to this. We need to use electricity and we need to use green electricity to replace fossil fuel energy used in both buildings and transportation. I'm really dumbing it down, which is why I refer you back to our website for the detail. But in terms of the elevator message, that's the second of three. And the third one is unique to what we have done in CACOR, is we know that targets have been set without reference to solid physical infrastructure modeling. So we need to advocate that Canada as a whole use a dynamic systems model, like the CANS one already available in Canada, to model the physical infrastructure changes required to reduce carbon. This is a more sophisticated one for certain places to lobby that we'll get to in a moment, perhaps. But it really is a unique finding because all of Canada's targets have been set without seriously good studies on looking at the physical infrastructure changes that are required to reduce carbon. So let me quote here. I'll read it. We can read it together. I'll read it aloud. We require a dynamic systems model which represents the physical state of Canada's energy system over time for the observed past and for alternative future scenarios. Changes considered by decision makers may be incorporated in scenarios, but they're constrained by the underlying physical accounting framework. This permits finding pathways to meet various targets that can actually reach those targets. We've relied very heavily on economists to do the work for us rather than the physicists, if you like, but price signals alone will not tell us how many GHGs can actually be reduced. By closing 3 coal-fired plants, by eliminating 20% of gasoline-powered cars, or heating 100,000 homes with geothermal versus natural gas, these kinds of options and choices need to be modeled to establish realistic targets, and they're desperately needed to provide us with short-term milestones. We need much work done both at a provincial level and the federal level to consider what infrastructure projects are needed and required. So to sum up, the key messages I would argue from Pathways are those 3: phase out, transition away fairly, stop the production of most oil and gas, period. Number 2, use green electricity to replace fossil fuel energy in transportation and buildings. Of course, there's a lot of detail around the changes needed for building codes, retrofits, solar, geothermal, air-to-air, ground heat source pumps, and so on. And the third one is to know what is possible. We need to employ a dynamic systems model like CANS, already available in Canada, to model the infrastructure changes to reduce carbon. Now, because so many people have not yet reached this business of the need to actually get out of the oil and gas industry in Canada, I want to show you this brief piece, and it's going to take me a while to get the arrow so that it will start up, unfortunately. I'm not sure why I'm having this trouble. Still gonna take a minute, but it should come.
The COVID pandemic has made it crystal clear that fossil fuel industries will never again be an engine of growth for Canada's economy. The pandemic has highlighted how fast the energy system is transitioning towards renewables. 33,000 jobs disappeared in Canadian fossil fuel industries between 2014 and 2019, and another 20,000 have disappeared during the pandemic. This is the time to move forward with an aggressive, compassionate plan to create jobs and facilitate transitions for fossil fuel workers and the communities where they live. Fossil fuel industries account for a surprisingly small share of total employment in Canada's labour market. Less than 1% of all jobs in Canada are in those industries. So over time, if we set a firm timetable and stick to it, the amount of reductions in employment from the phase out of fossil fuels is actually surprisingly modest, maybe 8,000 jobs per year over a 20-year period. For comparison purposes, Canada's labour market normally produces about 8,000 jobs every 10 days. It seems like a industries account for a surprisingly small share of total employment in Canada's labour market. Less than 1% of all jobs in Canada are in those industries. So over time, if we set a firm timetable and stick to it, the amount of reductions in employment from the phase out of fossil fuels is actually surprisingly modest, maybe 8,000 jobs per year over a 20-year period. For comparison purposes, Canada's labour market normally produces about 8,000 jobs every 10 days. It seems like a dramatic change to see the gradual phase out of all the jobs in fossil fuel industry. But Canada's experience is full of other examples of industries that declined over time or other industries that grew over time. In the 1901 census, the agriculture sector accounted for over 40% of all employment in Canada. Today, the number is 1.5%. In 1948, at the end of World War II, women made up just 21% of the workforce. Today, it's 48%, almost half. And families and communities, our whole economy, are much stronger because of it. We analyzed census data and we found 18 communities in Canada where fossil fuel employment accounts for over 5% of all jobs in that community. One big city, Calgary, and then 17 smaller cities or towns. The good news is that's 18 communities out of the hundreds of communities across the country. And if we make it a national priority, it's totally doable to make the transition fair and reasonable. Some politicians say they're defending fossil fuel workers by trying to delay and deny the inevitable transition away from fossil fuel industries. That's not doing any favor for fossil fuel workers. They're already losing work and their jobs are already being degraded with falling wages, falling health and safety conditions, and automation that replaces fossil fuel workers with machines in order to cut costs for their employers. The best thing to do for fossil fuel workers is recognize that this transition is happening, set a timetable and stick to it, and then give them the supports, the investments, the alternative jobs, and the early retirement incentives that are necessary so this transition can occur in an effective and humane way. Our report reviews the details of how many fossil fuel jobs there are in Canada, how we could transition away from fossil fuels without a painful disruption in our labor market, and 10 principles for how to manage that transition fairly and effectively. Please read our report for more details.
So I did want to make that point. It's interesting that in his conversation, he talks about the inevitable changes. And I think that's a good approach to keep in mind when we talk about the necessity for doing this, to use the language of inevitability. So now I want to get a little bit more focused. We've looked at knowing the messages and the need to take people to our website. And the focus today is not really just on individuals, but I encourage you to use all the options at your disposal: social media and letters, questions to candidates, come back to that. But in the main, this is such an enormous task that I think most of the work occurs after the election rather than during it. But that's not to say we shouldn't be pushing and probing our individual candidates as well in our ridings. Your MPs, your cabinet ministers, if you're able to do opinion pieces or personal contacts, if you have energy to do presentations to community groups or to line them up for others of us in CACOR to do, to other NGOs, to both federal and provincial, and to make sure that people are referencing our documents that give more detail to interested persons. Individuals can also make links to other organizations and seek to make presentations to influence them. But as we move to the CACOR level, either formally or informally, I think we do well to have a CACOR advocacy group. I'd want to see it linked to the board and the communications committee. And that part of the task of that group would be to ensure that presentations are ready to go, people are ready to deliver and line up to deliver them, and also to line up presentations. Part of the effort involves seeking good advice. We have limited energies to know where and when to push what levers. I would say that people like Catherine McKenna, just leaving the government with her cabinet experience and her work on infrastructure and earlier on climate change and environment, is a very good person for CACOR to talk with about approaches and ideas and suggestions, and even to help us open some doors for some of the conversations we need to have. I think it's useful because although the reports may be done by individuals, wherever we can actually get board agreement as to what is an organizational message, then we can post those for everyone and use in the name of CACOR rather than just in my name or your individual name, wherever that's possible. It will be important. So often organizations think about politicians, but whenever you meet, if you have an influential meeting with a cabinet minister, when he goes back to his office, he talks to one of his staff people and says, let's bounce this over to our deputy and get him to take a look at this. Let's ask him 2 or 3 questions based on the presentation we've had. So it's very important, in my experience, to try to meet with deputies or ADMs, or sometimes it'll be a director general or senior policy advisors. And it's not the environment and finance only, it's natural resources, it's infrastructure, it's transportation, the innovation science industry, the Privy Council. We want to use departmental assistants. They're often very, very helpful. You can go in cold and you can tell them what you want to accomplish. We'll look at that a little bit more further down. We want to know a timetable and speak at key committee hearings and/or prepare briefs to committees. I think the last budget had 57 individuals they heard, but they had something like 700 briefs. So while a brief may not be as influential, it's one way in a door if we don't have the credibility or we're not invited in. So we need to keep briefs in mind for many of the committees. I would not neglect the Senate. Senators are not without influence, and they do provide various opportunities. But overall, if we have a choice, I would concentrate on the cabinet and MPs, as well as to deputies and ADMs. But then if we do have a core pathways group, I want to look a little more closely at 2 government-created groups. One's called the Net Zero Advisory Group, which has been created by the Minister of the Environment, and the other by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, for requesting time for us to make presentations to them. And finally, it's important not to quit, because you never know what stone you throw in what pond creates what ripples. It's important to know timetables. Just in the 3rd column, you'll see March, February, March. Those are the dates when federal budgets are proposed. And there's many, many months, as most of you know, that goes into preparation leading up to that. But it's the time prior to these periods of budgets is an ideal time to get our thinking involved. So on this slide, for example, you will see that every year there are main estimates prepared by all of the departments. And they then get reviewed and pulled together by Treasury Board, and then the Cabinet, the Prime Minister's office adjusts these. And then early in the year, there's an Appropriations Act. And it is going to be in budgets generally that you will find the most significant possibilities for changes, because they have the money behind them. And most of the recommendations we have in mind are going to require different sums of funds. When you're looking to reach a deputy minister, you simply go on to the CEDS, CEDS, you'll see at the top, the government website. And if you look under deputy minister's office, you'll often find a phone number for the deputy minister, a couple of senior policy advisors, and then Anne Morin could be the most important person there, because she's the executive assistant to the deputy minister. And you can simply phone her if you're a part of our CACOR grouping to say, I would like to schedule a meeting with this person for a certain purpose. And she may say, you know what, he's not going to be available, but I can put you in touch with Fred so-and-so, who's his senior policy advisor on this matter. So it's a very straightforward matter to even start cold, even if you don't have a lot of contacts yourself to begin with. Now, this Net Zero Advisory Body, this has been created last February by the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. It's got a group of people from around the country who are considered to have knowledge, and you can bet your bottom dollar that if we make serious progress at influencing a minister or one of his advisors, they will bounce our presentation and our ideas back to this body and say, tell us what you think. we do not want to get sandbagged by a group dismissing our work. We want to bring them on side. We need to bring them on side. So if I run down this list, for example, some of you will know different people here, but I just pulled out 2 examples. Catherine is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, highly, highly sympathetic to what we're recommending. And here is the new Executive Director of the Pembina Institute, the institute I used to head. Again, an ideal person for one of us to contact to say, can you arrange for a presentation? There's another group that's been doing a lot of modeling for the government, and some of their modeling is dramatically undercutting the work that we've done because of the representation on it. So it would be a tough nut to crack. It's the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, and they've done a major report, and I'll just show you quickly. They are saying, we're not going to make choices for you, government. We're going to point out 3 possible futures. One of their futures is to continue with fossil fuels and then work on technologies that have negative emissions. As Dave pointed out, there's an awful lot of work to do, certainly to do it economically, to do significant negative emissions. But nevertheless, that's the kind of thing that they are putting up. And you can be darn sure that this is what the oil industry is lobbying for, with a lot more time and dollars than we will possess. The second one they're looking at is biofuels, with the kind of huge barriers that that would involve in Canada, but they put that forward as a serious option for government to consider as well, for the entire switch over to the energy system. And then finally, the third one that they put in place talks about electrification and hydrogen. And this one, I think most of us would find is much more consistent with the findings we have in Pathways. And so it would be a good place for us to lobby. Now, the kind of people we need in a meeting with a group like Canada Net Zero's group are people who are in the smaller core group, the Rob Hoffmans, the John Hollands, some of the rest of us who can actually speak to the detail of the report. But these groups, I'm making recommendations, not that these are the only bodies, but I'm trying to outline an approach that could be very useful for CACOR, being that we're housed right here in Ottawa, and that these organizations and deputy ministers are physically here and available, and we need them to be on side to make political progress at the federal level. So I want to end here because the main thing I think is for some discussion. I've suggested a few things that individuals can do that you already know about. I'm suggesting a certain kind of approach with CACOR, that we need an active advocacy group to try to consolidate and coordinate messages. It needs to be linked to the board and communications. And then we need to target a timetable of presentations, requests for presentations, and certain organizations that are serving as advisory bodies that can either support or undercut the work that Pathways has already produced. So I think on that note, I should end it and turn it over to the question period. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Those were both extremely interesting presentations, and David, I hope that we can have some discussion, especially about advocacy and how we can move ahead. And perhaps that might be a continuing discussion that we have at our AGM that's upcoming on the 27th of September. So that I think that those were really good things. So to begin with, we have a few people who have put some questions out there on the chat line. The first person who made a comment was Barry Bruce, and on deck there's Peter Balkowski. So Barry, if you can unmute and go ahead, and Peter, you be prepared for your talk or for your presentation. So go ahead, Barry.
Okay, well, this has to do with more the psychology of change. I think a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the temperate zones where the climate impact is felt the least. in Canada, for example. So how important do you think this is with respect to the will to implement some of these more drastic climate change policies?
Dave Dougherty, do you want to address that question or?
Sure. So I started my presentation by showing you a comment from a farmer on the prairies. And you might have seen pictures. I was actually off trying to find one of a fellow near Edmonton who was standing in a field of grain that was up to his shoulders last year, and standing in that very same field this year, and the grain isn't even up to his ankles.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of people on the prairies who are still willing to say, as did the fellow whom I quoted, this isn't climate change. This isn't the fault of humanity. So I do think we will find there are lots of people who are not yet convinced that this is in fact happening. And I suspect that's why at the recent convention of the Conservative Party of Canada, they refused to vote for a proposal that said that they should acknowledge that climate change is happening. So I think this is a big problem. I recently heard a fellow on the radio who had been burned out in one of the fires in BC. And he was saying, this isn't climate change. We have fires all the time. And of course, if you look at the grand scale across the world, the frequency of fires is up in a lot of places, the intensity of fires, the size of fires. And the same thing can be said for all kinds of other effects of climate change. It's quite clear in the IPCC's recent report, this is happening.
Yeah.
People don't have to believe it for it to be happening.
Yeah.
It's still happening. And it is, in fact, happening to us. Just this morning on CBC, there were two programs. One was What on Earth, and it was followed by Ontario at Noon, that were discussing climate change. And a number of people, including some physicians, said, look, I have people coming into my practice who are suffering the effects of climate change. It's causing, for example, heart attacks. It's causing severe asthma attacks. So like, you don't have to believe that it's going to cause it. If you get an asthma attack or a heart attack, well, without medical care, you'll die.
Yeah, but you're less likely to attribute it to climate change. I mean, farmers, especially in the West, are used to having bad years and remember well, we don't remember the dirty 30s, but we remember our parents talking about them perhaps. So
Sure.
It is difficult for people to attribute changes which seem to be consistent with past bad luck to climate change. And I'm wondering if politicians maybe even take advantage of this bit of a blind spot, well, a major blind spot to avoid taking actions which may be unpopular, especially amongst the oil and gas crowd.
Well, they aren't necessarily unpopular amongst the entire citizenry, but they certainly can be unpopular amongst some vocal groups.
Yeah.
Barry,
Thank you. Oh, David, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's a multiplicity of factors closing in on both the world and Canada, so that you'll find it coming from multiple sources. For example, there are Norwegian wealth funds or the Harvard University who will no longer invest in the oil sands in Alberta. You'll find the whole fear of stranded assets, and gradually you'll see some companies, even without government action, moving more toward positioning for our future with hydrogen as a use. You'll find Canada's sense of itself with our iconic pride in the North. You know, there'll be a certain amount of strength that will come from World Wildlife Fund, for example, or from Prince Edward Island finding how much it's losing of its land mass as water is rising, or a whole series of international fora where you've got more and more climate refugees impinging maybe more strongly first on Europe than on North America. But I think all of these factors, of course, it will be a battle, just like with tobacco, where you had the tobacco interests lobbying very hard to maintain the status quo. We found the same thing with the oil companies, but you're now beginning to find a certain separation from the oil companies. And so as we have more fires, more drought and so on, Barry, I agree with you. There's going to be deniers, and it's going to take something strong to change certain people's minds. And not everybody's mind will be changed, but I think all of these factors collectively will gradually push Canadian decision makers into recognizing they need to make changes. And if we can nudge that ahead faster, then we're doing everyone a really major favor.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's an interesting segue into the observation and the comment that Peter had put into the chat line. So Peter, over to you.
All of the solutions that are proposed are dramatically more expensive than the existing technologies. That is fine for people like myself who is retired. I have no debts. I have my house paid off. I have some pension money. For most of the younger people in their 20s who are just coming out of school, colleges, universities, they can't afford to buy a home of any sort. Take a look at realtor.ca and look at the cost of places in Ottawa. They're struggling to rent. A major portion of their gross income goes for very basics. And the proposals that are all coming, and this is why there is a great reluctance from government and others, is that you're going to drive a large portion of the younger population into poverty. For the seniors who are not like me, who are perhaps didn't have the same good jobs, didn't have the same savings attribute, they are slipping into poverty. Calgary has seen taxes and utility increases that have been double, triple, quadruple the consumer price index every year, basically for the last decade. You are proposing very high cost solutions. How can you convince people that are now struggling to survive to buy into that?
Okay, I'd like to take a crack at that first, if I may. First of all, what you've just described is that the current economic system is not working for everybody.
Agreed.
In fact, it's making life extremely difficult for millennials or even people a little bit younger than that. It's also making life difficult for many seniors. I agree with you entirely. That's one of the reasons why we need a fundamental rethink of the way that we run our society. That aside, switching to a technology that doesn't result in climate change is in fact not more expensive. These days, wind and solar are two of the technologies, and there are some others that are considerably less expensive even than coal and natural gas. Oil is more expensive than those two, but wind and solar and geothermal are way less expensive. This is definitely the technology of the 21st century. David,
Pollock, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm not convinced that you will have to convince the poorest economically in our society to be supportive of the changes which are pressed in on us. There's been dozens and dozens of policies, that have been put in place with all kinds of inequities in them. I'm not in favor of inequity, but I'm just saying that once a company, I know a particular company right now has just decided that hydrogen is the way to go. It's been involved in natural gas. You will soon see them lobbying for more tax breaks and tax incentives to make a transition so that hydrogen can be produced and their pipelines can transport it. So the lobbying will come from various sectors, but I'll just make the point also that there's going to have to be very, very significant government support to allow these transformations to occur. But, you know, with electric vehicles, the auto manufacturers today are saying that by about 2027 was one study I saw, should put the price point for a new automobile, electric to fossil fueled automobile, on an equivalency. So I've certainly seen the cost of solar panels reduced dramatically. So yes, there's going to be huge expense, and it is going to be on government's shoulders, which means all of us, to support the weaker sectors of society as we make that transition, which is why in part I showed that fair transition video.
Government expense is primarily going to be on the shoulders of the younger people who are barely getting by right now.
Interesting. Thank you, Peter. Art, you wanted to make one smart comment before Anitra goes.
Yeah, I just want to comment that perhaps I'm one of a few people on this conversation that has a completely solar house. I have Tesla batteries. I have a ground source heat pump. I can live off grid I've proved that I could live off grid for 300 days. And I'm making changes. What is kind of important about this is that I constantly get the same, it's very expensive message. I'm in the midst of preparing a presentation to the group of 78 on the 30th of September, which refutes that totally. In fact, it's making money for me. It's an investment that is paying me, and it is I'm making sufficient amount of money now that it's being turned into buying me a Tesla Model 3 car. So this whole too expensive argument, I think is a myth. Anyway, I wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Those were really good points, and I appreciate that. Anitra, you're up, and John Mayer, you're on deck.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to thank the whole Pathway group for having done a very important study and presenting it and putting it on the CACOR website, but particularly Dave, the two Daves, David and David, for presenting this in a very clear way. And I understand a great deal more about Canadian advocacy pathways into the bowels of the legislature now. Thank you. I think we should all pause for one moment and think that we have been pursuing a great deal of economic capitalism in our 400-year histories of North America, and think about other moral imperatives that become more important to us at this point, having considered the pandemic. And one of those is wellness of the earth and regeneration. And I'm sorry that the Pathway did not consider some of the regenerative portions, because both Canada, the United States have wiped out huge amounts of the original habitat. There's only 15% of the original habitat left in the terrestrial portion of the earth, and only 50% left in the seas. And this, of course, is how nature takes care of carbon dioxide scrubbing from the air. The plants, which produce the oxygen we're all breathing right now, take the carbon dioxide out, they incorporate it in their tissue, and they put it down into the earth and bury it firmly. And of course, this is what we need, but nobody has scaled it up. Canada has magnificent technologies for restoring forest, almost all used by the lumbering, some by environment. But this has to be scaled up into a huge effort. partly volunteer, partly paid. Some of these transitioning oil workers can easily be taught these skills, as well as their organizational logistics skills put to work. In the Sea of Canada, which is vast, if you include the Arctic Sea, as well as Canada is a nation of immigrants and has deep ties into many countries in the Western Hemisphere, as well as Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and they could have groups going to help these other countries, such as Haiti, who has lost almost 100% of its forestation on land and 100% of its sea forestation, to reforest and regenerate, and that helps also in the global footprint. So I'm just trying to put a piece in this little discussion called regeneration of vital plant ecosystems, be they Arctic ecosystems, oceanic ecosystems, third world country ecosystems, which have been completely knocked out, and that this could be of service in the stabilization of the rise of temperature. Thank you.
Thank you, Anitra. Those are interesting comments. Do either Dave or David wish to add to what Anitra has said?
Just very briefly, Anitra, to say that what we had access to as a small organization with small resources was the wonderful CANAS modeling that Rob Hoffman had access to, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if he wasn't a friend, you know. But that was focused on the energy system. And we've recognized that what we also need is much more work that we can pull together. There's been quite a bit done in Canada on the agricultural, biological, forestry sectors. So this whole regeneration piece, I don't think that we would at all want to discount how important it could be. It's just we have not looked at that to date yet.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
And I might add that I know, Anitra, you've done a lot of work on seagrass, and I know you are very active in mangrove work as well. We don't happen to have much in the way of mangroves, as far as I know, in Canada. I'm not sure we have much in the way of seagrass beds. There are great beds all around the world that could be regenerated, but at the moment, if we keep producing and using fossil fuels at the rate that we're using them, the Earth doesn't have the capacity to take up that carbon dioxide. And we recently, within the last 6 months or so, found out that the soil that we thought could be used as a carbon sink is in fact not working as a carbon sink in the way that we thought it was. So there are major problems on that front. Not that I'm trying to say we shouldn't try regeneration. We should, because we need every single arrow that we can get out of that quiver. This is such a big problem, and people have been putting it off for more than 40 years. Essentially, now we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of a decade left to try to get all the work we should have been doing over the last 40 years done.
It could be a wonderful transition pivot for a lot of those oil workers to learn the simple technologies, because they already have tremendous logistical skills of sending them abroad by Environment Canada and your International Development Foundation to all these places that have lost huge amount of mangroves and huge amount of seagrass all over the world, and let them help these developing countries, particularly in the British Commonwealth group that you're very friendly with, but also where you have immigrant context to do this, but you do have lots of seagrasses, and a lot of them have been badly, but you don't have any mangroves. You're right, except if you remember Uncle Mo's jungle adventure, where he bought a piece of Panama or Costa Rica or something, and that was going to be in carbon when he was head of electrical Ontario, Canada. Remember that? And he bought a large piece of the jungle, Maurice Strong.
Yes.
Anyhow, that's a joke.
Thank
Well, I
you.
do think we should take over the Turks and Caicos. They wanted to join us. We should do that.
Okay, okay. John Mayer, you're up, and Bob Walker, you're on deck.
Yeah, thanks very much for this. The financial, I think we have to differentiate between the commercial economy measured in dollars and the biophysical economy measured in real units. Trying to mix them, I don't think works. We won't find economic justification for doing what needs to be done biophysically, I don't believe. And even when you look at something like the financial viability of the oil sands, I don't think it is, frankly, financially viable. It turns a lot of dollars. But if you look at what's happened to Alberta in terms of the debts built up in areas which aren't directly attributable to the oil sands, the cost of cleanups, the legacy costs, and the government deficits, since the oil sands began producing in quantity over the last 20 years, they've increased their fiscal debt, the government debt in Alberta, by $100 billion. And depending on which figures you believe, there's $60 to $250 billion extra in legacy costs. Those aren't built into the profitability of what we consider to be the viability of the oil sands. When you do add those things in, I don't think it's viable. So I think that has to be addressed. We have to look at the full life cycle costs of things, whether it's financial or biophysical, and I wouldn't mix the two. And I also wanted to mention the bias built into public policy. That second group that you mentioned, I didn't write it down, but I think I spoke to them a couple of years ago, who was building Canada's environmental future on decarbonization programs, biofuels, and hydrogen. None of those three work. They just don't work biophysically. Biofuels don't work at this latitude. The most recent European study on biofuels, very negative. And decarbonization, if you look at the energy to decarbonize plus where you're going to put it, it doesn't work. Hydrogen is a niche fuel if it works, but it's extremely lossy. So groups like that are set up, I believe, to absorb and deflect. And we wouldn't spend any time on them, I hope. But there's a huge bias built into public policy apparatus now that will automatically reject what we're saying. So that's okay. If you want to comment on that, that's the point.
Anybody to comment? David? Dave?
I'd certainly invite comments from other people as well. I mean, I agree with you that we need to be looking at life cycle costs. I was once tangentially involved in some work regarding the giant Yellowknife mine, where they took out something on the order of $4 billion worth of gold. Well, it turns out that trying to manage the abandoned mine is going to end up costing us $4 billion. You might as well have not done the work.
Exactly, a make work project.
Well, you pretty well got the same thing going on with the surface mining that's happening in Alberta.
Yeah.
David Pollock, do you have any questions and comments? No?
Well, I'm just thinking there were several things made. In the main, I agree with the fact that there's two different things when you're looking at dollars in the economy, and then you're looking at physical units. I'm not so sure I agree with what you've said. We'd have to have a longer discussion around hydrogen, because I know, for example, Germany's already operating its first passenger trains using hydrogen. I think it could be a niche while electric batteries are being, the science and the technology is being improved for long distance trucking. I think there is a serious move toward a certain percentage of our energy needs to be fulfilled by either blue or green hydrogen in the years ahead. At least money's being invested into that sector by a lot of the investment community. So we'll see. I think the story's out on hydrogen and to what extent it can be useful at this point.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
you.
Thank you.
Bob, this is also a little bit of a segue perhaps for you.
Yeah. Well, let me begin with a comment and then a question. And the question wouldn't be a surprise to this group. It'll be on nuclear energy. But my comment, I mean, I've been a government ADM, and Dave, the way you described the lobby effort is exactly the way it works.
Thank you.
However, I'd like to just suggest you add to this an advocacy that's actually targeting who makes decisions in Canada around energy mix. And let's be clear, it is not the federal government. It puts in place barriers and enablers, such as a carbon tax, but this is actually a provincial and territorial authority. And how does that work? And again, it does not tend to even be cabinet and ministers. It tends to be delegated authorities to regulators. For example, in Ontario, it's related to the Ontario Energy Board and the Independent Electricity Systems Operator. These are the people that made the decisions on how we got off coal in Ontario. So how do we actually lobby the decision makers that actually influence the energy mix in Canada? And it's obviously a complicated story, but I think an important one to have some clarity on. That said, what you put at the federal level, exactly. I guess so. My question is quite to the point. I haven't heard the word nuclear energy mentioned. Is it an arrow in the quiver or not? And if not, could you just give me a bit of a sense as to why not?
Maybe I could just thank you very much for that piece in terms of referencing the provincial decision-making and the regulators. I think we've done a certain amount of outreach, through COVID with our Zoom presentations. So it used to be that nearly everybody that was around was in Ottawa. Hopefully we will develop more of a national presence with more legs on the ground for some of those conversations that are often accomplished by having people right in Toronto, for example, if it was Ontario we were focusing on. But what I should say is, as an organization, we've very rarely gone down the road of taking positions as an organization. It's quite new that we've been given the power to do that. So there are those within CACOR who are fundamentally opposed to nuclear energy. I used to head up the Pembina Institute and was out on a limb with a lot of my environmental friends because I did some independent research on nuclear energy, and I thought it was actually a very good option in certain cases. And this was before some of the modular sort of next generation nuclear has had development. So I understand that on a life cycle basis, there may be some major costs to it, but on a greenhouse gas basis, of course, it could be extremely useful for us. How much of that could be put in place in the time frame that we have, I think is a real question. But that could be a question for many of the technologies. So I personally, in a list of questions that are posted currently on the CACOR website, did reference nuclear, a new next generation nuclear, as a potential solution to reducing greenhouse gases, which would be relevant in some areas of the country.
I'll take a kick at this if you wish. If you have a comment, go ahead, Bob.
Well, I guess as perhaps I can only say as a platform, I think I saw the title for informed debate. I would welcome an opportunity to have a discussion with colleagues in CACOR who are fundamentally opposed to nuclear energy, and to look at the arguments for and against. As David said, we need an arrow in every quiver. Mm-hmm. Are we having a 1980s debate around a technology, or are we having a 2021 debate about a climate emergency? Mm-hmm. And I think this is perhaps a topic I, for one, suggest that if we go forward with an agenda that says we are supporting green energy, my concern is that we will immediately be seen as in a certain category that's an anti not only fossil fuels, but anti the full spectrum of technologies that can actually make a difference. And that I personally feel would be a negative overall, including on the image for CACOR. Now, let's have the debate, but I think it would have to be fairly urgent because I, for one, would be not open to putting my name on a pathway forward that rejects a technology that has a chance of contributing. We need every arrow in the quiver. Thank you.
I think that's a reasoned stance. I will tell you that I have the Pathways document open in the background on my machine. And immediately after you asked your question, I did a search in the Pathways document for the word nuclear. It does appear once. What I can tell you is that we were told the modelers took into consideration all of the known plans, so published plans about what various organizations like provincial governments had on the books at the time that they started this work back in, I think it was 2019. So to my own limited knowledge, uninformed as I am, I don't think anybody actually has a plan to install a new nuclear reactor in Canada. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You are absolutely incorrect.
Okay,
Absolutely
so
incorrect.
what do we have? What do we have?
So right now, Ontario's committed to build the first small modular reactor at its Darlington site, 300 megawatts. That will be built by 2028. Saskatchewan has said, if that works, we will build a fleet of up to 4 in the province of Saskatchewan. It will be the anchor of the path to get off coal and natural gas. The province of New Brunswick has committed to build 2 SMRs at its La Prose site in the early 2030s. Yes, these are not solutions that are going to be delivered by 2030, but in getting to a pathway of 2050, nuclear is a serious option that needs to be considered. And frankly, it enables the deployment of renewables because while renewable cost is low, it is this nagging difficulty to supply energy when needed. And nuclear can be the dispatchable solution that really does make renewables work that much better. This is a deep and powerful discussion that we all need to have. I simply say, let's not rule out something that can make a difference. Plans are unfolding to make it real across the world. I just think ruling it out at first glance is a wrong approach to have, but I may be convinced otherwise. Let's just have the discussion.
I think the discussion is great. Don't want to give you the impression that I'm ruling it out in any way. There have been at least 2 Zoom presentations that I recall in this series that discussed nuclear, both of which I thought were great. And I think there's great promise in this new generation of apparently much safer nuclear energy solutions. And they would help us to get rid of the accumulated waste at the same time. So I think it's certainly something we need to have as part of the solution. I don't see it, as you said, the first one of which you're aware is going to come online maybe in 2028. Of course, we know in the past, many of these projects have been delayed by many years. So let's say it comes online by 2030. It still gives us most of this decade to decide what the heck are we going to do? And the sooner we do it, the better. The more that we delay, the more we get into the same kind of trouble that we've been having build up on us in the last 40 years.
I would add too, Bob, this is very good news about nuclear. I think this is really good to know that they're moving ahead with it. And yeah, as far as I know, the Pathways people did not look at any specific way of generating energy, whether it be solar or wind or any of the others, other than the extraction of fossil fuels. That was the only part of the energy system that they were actually looking at in detail.
I'd have to say that's not accurate, Gene.
Well,
Jane, may
yeah.
I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that when Bastian, our analyst, did his work when we were looking at reductions in fossil fuel, he recognized that substitute electricity would have to be put in place. So he simply made the assumption that whatever energy system was in place in a given province would be enlarged and enhanced. And so in that way, in Ontario, for example, and New Brunswick, it was assumed that nuclear would be a part of the mix.
And they did mention that they were looking at things like solar panels, wind turbines, geothermal turbines, nuclear reactors. So they did look at this in some detail.
Good. Thank you.
Folks, I don't want to dominate, but if I could just put one other thought we need to have in there.
Excellent.
The lifetime of these plants, solar and wind, is projected to be on the order of 20 years.
Right.
That means installed capacity. Essentially every installed energy system we have in Canada today has to be replaced at least once by 2050.
Yeah.
So everything we're trying to do in 2030, it will be needed to be replaced at least once by 2050. Maybe replacing it with nuclear provides a longer term solution going forward. So all to say, let's just have that discussion when we can. I think my only concern is with the use of the word green in your second theme here, Dave's, and it seems to be that many in the world associate that nuclear cannot be considered green.
That's interesting, Bob. When I wrote it, I did not rule nuclear out at all. But in terms of our language, given that others might, I think there is a need to clarify that. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Ray Desjardins, you're up next, and Jeff Passmore, you're on deck.
Okay, one thing.
Yes.
Sorry.
We can hear you.
One thing that is not mentioned is solar radiation management, and I'm quite worried when I hear people talking of planting trees. I've done a lot of work on the boreal forest, for example, and the net radiation difference between the boreal forest and the grassland or agricultural region was 14 watt per meter square, which is equivalent to 7 degrees C. So until when we did the boreal experiment, people did not realize this big difference in albedo and net radiation. So planting trees in the northern hemisphere is not a very wise thing. These days, I'm publishing some papers on solar radiation management for agricultural region, and I calculate the CO2 equivalent CO2 drawdown for different practices like reduced summer fallow, no-till, different choice of crop, and the CO2 equivalent drawdown is equivalent to the carbon sequestration numbers, and they complement each other. So I think we need to. It's not a big solution, but it's one that is well worth looking at, and we have several publications on that. But it's hard to promote these things because everything people mention about is either carbon sequestration or reducing greenhouse gas emission, and not this kind of thing. So I'm looking for ways to promote this more. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Any comments?
Well, perhaps I'd like a clarification, actually. Ray, when you say solar radiation management and mention that planting trees isn't a good idea, what are you advocating?
I'm of it. Yeah. For example, trees, there's different things like conifers and deciduous. There's quite a bit of difference. There's 2 watt. But planting trees is not the solution. I'm not advocating cutting the boreal forest, but I want people to be aware that planting trees in the southern hemisphere is good, but in the northern hemisphere where we have snow, it's not a magic solution, and it should not even be promoted. You know, in agriculture, there are a few things we can do. Choice of crop, being more aware that solar radiation management is an option. You know, and it's hard. what I'm advocating is not to promote planting trees in the northern hemisphere practically as a solution, because it's not a solution. It will cause more warming than the cooling due to carbon sequestration in trees. You know? And it's good people to be aware of that, because I don't think people are aware of that all that much.
If you do have some papers, perhaps you might want to submit them, that could be posted on the CACOR website if they are for general consumption.
Yeah, they're general consumption. In 2007, we wrote a few comparing the net radiation between oral forests and agriculture. And now I just have some ones, two have just been, one is published, one has just been accepted on what agriculture can do. For example, the choice of crops makes a big difference. Like and these things like no-till, you capture more snow in the winter, and it's a net benefit not only from sequestration but from the radiation balance. I'll post them on the website.
Thank you. Jeff, you're up, and Nigel Weir, you're on deck.
Thanks very much, Jean. I'm going to be fast because we're losing a lot of people, and there's still a lot of people after me. But I mean, quick points I made. I'm surprised we haven't heard more about demand reduction. We've heard a lot about supply, but nothing about energy efficiency or conservation. And maybe it is there in the report that I missed. On the question of advocacy, my point there was simply, David, you mentioned knowing our messages, but we also have to know the messages of the people that we're advocating to, and frame our ask such that it meets their policy objectives. I wouldn't start with the minister, because the first question the minister is going to ask is, what do my officials say? What have my officials told you? And if your answer is we haven't met with them, then he's not or she's not going to be very impressed. Often it's the senior policy advisor to the minister, I'm not talking about a bureaucrat here. I'm talking about the political appointee who is the most influential in getting something on the minister's agenda. The other point I made about autocracy, I don't have a lot of faith that we can deliver. We can't even agree on what we want to say here in this small group of people, let alone in Canada writ large. So, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I said we need a climate-friendly autocracy if we're going to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, because democracy isn't going to get us there in the time frame we need. I like John Mayer's comment about there's a lot of groups out there whose intent is just to deflect. We have to be careful who we advocate to. Dan Wicklund, for example, he's a longtime friend of mine, but he's just switched from shilling for the oil and gas and tar sands industry to shilling for the natural gas industry, promoting blue hydrogen. So, you know, we have to be careful and know what the prejudices are of the people that we're going to lobby. And as I say, frame our ask such that it at least partially meets their objectives, so that they don't just write us off as what you described, David, as the lunatic fringe. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, just one. Points well made, Jeff. I agree with all of it. But with not sort of the exception, but embedded in the pathways study are some reductions that would be on the demand side in terms of energy efficiency. But I think for myself, now speaking for myself, the level of crisis is so great that while it would be good for governments to call for, and for, you know, a few years ago, there were possibilities of replacing your freezer free of charge because Ontario Hydro would come in and do that for you with an energy efficient freezer, that kind of thing. I just think that the kind of changes that are needed are pretty massive. And I think that the focus does need to be on the production and supply side. Even though we could add to it, and it will be done with building codes, for example, that are coming in, is probably one of the principal ways in which governments can facilitate that. But it does take an awful long time if it's just a focus on individuals. So,
well, I guess it's just one more arrow in the quiver that maybe we overlooked is my point. Yes, of course, we need supply side, but demand reduction is one more arrow in the quiver.
Yeah, no disagreement.
That's one of the reasons I raised this issue of how many people we're going to have in the country.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, I see that Nigel has left, but basically his comment was to the effect that you've done really good presentation and the discussion has been great, and he really supports the advocacy work that you were proposing, David. So he had to leave, but Ted Manning he's got next comments, and at the moment he's the last speaker that we have online. So Ted, go ahead and we will continue.
I have 2 or 3 comments. One is so much of our stuff is sold to other people, we can't manage the demand. And as long as there's a huge demand out there for our stuff, we have a serious issue. And all we can really do is manage supply. It'd be really nice if we could tell them to stop buying it from us, but let's see how that goes over politically. Second comment is that some people already believe climate change is real and are spending a lot of money to fix it. And that includes the insurance industry in particular, where they're putting a lot more costs in for anybody who decides to do something that is climatically dangerous to themselves or to their future profit line or to their liability. And they have been a significant asset internationally, probably are now in Canada too, to convincing people who are trying to build new stuff not to sink their money into places where climate could damage it, or where they could be sued for doing something to exacerbate the impacts on other people. And the third comment I've got has to do with nuclear, which we did in fact talk about a lot. We just didn't have a heck of a lot of data on it. And we were looking really at how do we manage gross overall production. We did not spend our time dividing it amongst the new technologies to see who was going to win and who was going to lose. We all felt that significant changes would have to be made. And one of the biggest ones was the reduction of the production of fossil fuels and replacement by any other technology. And we had discussed several. The one I liked best was putting new next generation nuclear in the north, putting them away from areas where they could have the most significant impacts, placing them on the source of the uranium if they wanted to, and where they could dig the hole to put it back. And guess where that is? It's Lake Athabasca. And there are now technologies which would quite easily transfer the electricity from there to the main grid, through using the same new graphene systems they're using in China, where they are bringing electricity from solar fields in the Gobi, literally nearly 10,000 miles to the source of demand in the east. So there are very few climatic or very few technological barriers anymore. But as everybody recognizes, there's money needed, and therefore will. But yes, I think it's really worthwhile having a further exploration of nuclear options as one of our presentations in the near future.
Any comments, David or Dave?
I have a comment. I'm just not sure what your point was, Ted, on energy demand reduction. I understand that it is our demand which creates the need for supply, and hence we are the responsible ones.
No, it's not our demand. It's the demand of the world. And we are fine. Suppliers.
Well, let me finish. First of all, you could have demand reduction domestically. But secondly, yes, demand creates the need for supply, and something that very few of us recognize, that it's us that is causing the externalities. Yeah. You know, we always talk about externalities and blame it on somebody else. It's my demand that's creating the, the need for electricity supply and the need for fossil fuels so I can drive my vehicle. So, but I don't, yes, we can't do much about demand for exports, but we can certainly do something domestically. And if we don't have demand reduction in our portfolio as CACOR, then we're not going to be very well liked by some of the environmental groups with whom David suggests we might want to collaborate. I'm sure that Catherine Abreu has demand reduction as one of her top priorities.
No, we've actually talked about giving everybody a quota for energy, which they're not allowed to exceed during their lifetime. And they're starting to draw down right now. And most of us are well over our quota.
Absolutely. No, that's a good suggestion, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could create a marketplace and actually trade that quota and sell futures.
Art would have a lot to sell us. Those of us
Yeah,
who are over demand, we could buy from Art.
Well,
I buy clean energy from Art as opposed to filthy energy from other people.
I've reduced my demand to zero.
Excellent, excellent. I have to apologize. Mary Hagan had her hand up and I totally missed it. And Mary, that's my apology. So you are next. So please go ahead.
Okay, just on this last discussion, I've been advocating that we should all have a passport with a certain limit of CO2 emissions that we can use in a year, and that we can pick and choose whether we fly the plane or drive our car or stay at home all day. But something along that line would be rather, I think, worthwhile. Anyway, I was really wanting to talk about the next steps for the Pathway Project, and I'm, of course, very excited about Pathway Advocacy Initiative. And I really pick up on Jeff Passmore's comment about still being a little confused on what is the message of CACOR. Now, maybe it's in the report and it wasn't discussed in detail right now. I heard physical infrastructure projects. I learned, new job transition initiatives and that kind of thing. But before you worry about who you talk to, find out about their personality and what they want to do and what they don't want to do, and who your partners are when you make presentations, I think we really, as CACOR, need to know what our key messages are. And I appreciate the Pathway Project was primarily a focus on the energy mix. So I didn't know whether Anita's and some of the other comments that came up today would be part of a key message or not.
So may I comment? I was zeroing in on the Pathways report, and I think the messages are clear. I think, unlike many organizations that are trying to say we can still have, maybe the Liberal Party, for example, we can still keep fossil fuels. The results of Pathways are saying, no, we have to transition out of fossil fuel production. So that's one very clear message that some organizations share, but not all. And the second one has to do with the need to find other ways of heating and cooling our space in all of our buildings, and to use more electricity, and to generate that electricity in what I had called a green way, and to use that also for transportation. So those were the two central messages, even if somebody else added in the very important point that don't just call it green or people will think that you're absolutely opposed to nuclear. And that was not what I was trying to say. So maybe that needs some changing. And then the third finding was one more for governments in terms of what methods they're going to use going forward, because we've missed our targets so often. They haven't used the kind of modeling that looks at the physical infrastructure in the country the way that the Pathways databases did. So to me, those were the messages from Pathways. What CACOR advocates for over time may include additional.
You've muted, David. You've muted yourself.
Not sure where I was in my last sentence anyway.
Yes.
Thank you. No, it's okay.
Okay.
But remember that when we make the messages out, we are allowed to elaborate it on the key messages. If people ask, well, how are you going to do that?
Absolutely.
And there's a lot more in the written stuff on the website that you can look at, as well as a whole series of messages and ways that if you read it, you'll figure out how you can probably best position it to your own group or to your own friends.
Okay, so it's in the report. Okay, thank you. So I get then the feeling, David and others, that you're pretty confident on the messaging. So it's now down to the processes and timetable for doing the advocacy piece. Is that where you're at?
That's where I'm at, and I think a lot of people both around the board table and in the organization want to see us do more advocacy than we've done in the past. And I think we're pretty much ready to do that now that we've produced our own intellectual property, if you like, that we can speak to. And I think that it was important to have that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have 2.5 weeks and we can advocate to the voter. And then after that, we'll deal with what structures, institutions, governments we have just voted in.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I don't mind joining you on that task, since that's what I work on a lot of my time every day.
Thank you, Mary.
I had a politician on my step yesterday who was asking me what the principal issues was, and I was happy to tell him. He actually seemed reasonably open to the idea that maybe this is a big enough problem that perhaps all three of the major parties should get together and on a coalition to actually try and solve it. At least he didn't yell at me.
What a good idea. Hey, Mary, Rick Carpenter just put up on the chat line that you'll be pleased to know that on November 24th, there'll be a speaker who is going to be talking about the whole idea of personal greenhouse gas quotas. So be prepared for November 24th. With that, we have no other speakers lined up, and I would really like to take this opportunity to thank both David and David for the excellent presentation and discussion that they led today. I really, really appreciate that. But more than that, I would really like to thank the Pathways team and the two principal authors for the work that they put into producing this document that is going to be so critical for some of the work that we move forward to. John Hollins had been with us earlier today, and Rob Hoffman is on his way home. He was not available today. So I just want to say again, just thank you so much. They did an absolutely wonderful job. And with that, I'd also like to say, any of you, all of the documents that we had and that are under discussion today are on the CACOR.com website or CanadianCorps.com. And the Pathways project is a very large part of that opening page on CanadianCorps.com. So please take a look at the documents, read them, look at them, and so on. For those of you who are not a member of CACOR, you are still able to look at that website, but I would encourage you to try and join us. We are a Canadian charity, and receipts would be available for membership. And there will be more speakers to come. This particular talk will be put up on a CACOR YouTube website, and we hope that if you go to look at any of this talk or any of the others that we have up there, that you would think to subscribe to our YouTube channel. With that, I'd like to say thank you. And again, David and Dave, thank you very much for a great presentation.